All right, good afternoon and happy May Day. Welcome to the campus of Southwest Minnesota State University on this rather cold and dreary spring day. But I am pleased that so many of you have come out to join this conversation about Minnesota politics, past and present. My name is Dr. Anita Gall, and I am a history instructor at Minnesota West Community and Technical College. I am also the chair of the Lyon County DFL unit. Before we introduce our speakers, it is important to acknowledge the groups that have come together to make this event happen. The sponsors represent a bipartisan coalition of student and community groups, and I would like them to introduce themselves now.
Hello. Yes, I am Ben Brose. I'm a professional writing, communication, and political science major here at SMSU, and I am the president of College Democrats. I'm also an athlete, which is why I am not wearing a tie today.
He's got a track meet later on today. Good luck, buddy.
Thank you.
My name is Jake Samp. I am the president of the Political Science and Pre-Law Association. I'm a junior from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, majoring in political science with a minor in public administration.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming out. We really appreciate it. My name is Jesse McCardle. I am currently a senior here at SMSU, majoring in political science and history with a minor in pre-law and public administration. And I'm the current acting chairman of the SMSU College Republicans and also a member of the local Lyon County Republican unit.
I'm Levi Magnuson. I am currently the vice president of the SMSU History Club. I am a freshman from Canton, South Dakota, and I am a history major, and next year I'll be the president of the SMSU History Club.
I would also like to thank SMSU Forensics, Professor Ben Walker, and Dr. David Sturrock for the work that they have done to bring this event to campus. Please join me in thanking all of them for their support. All right, our distinguished speakers today are former United States Senator David Durenberger and Lori Sturdivant, co-authors of the book When Republicans Were Progressive, recently published by the Minnesota Historical Society. If you have not yet read the book, there are copies for sale at the SMSU bookstore table, which is off to my right here, your left, and I encourage you to check those out after the presentation today. I would also like to point out that there are cookies, juice, and coffee available, so if you skipped your lunch to be here and you need something just a little bit to tide you over, there's cookies over there. All right. And now to introduce our speakers. Lori Sturdivant is the author or editor of 11, count them 11, you are so productive, 11 books and a 3-time winner of the Minnesota Book Award. Her books include The Pillsburys of Minnesota, Her Honor, Rosalie Wall and the Minnesota Women's Movement, and Finding Common Ground, The Art of Legislating in an Age of Gridlock. Many of you will recognize her name from her career as an editorial writer and columnist for the Star Tribune. She is now retired from the Star Tribune editorial board, but continues as an occasional columnist for the paper.
Mr. David Durenberger was Minnesota's Republican U.S. Senator from 1978 to 1994. During his time in the Senate, he chaired the Senate Intelligence Committee and became known as an expert on health care issues. Since leaving the Senate, he founded the National Institute of Health Policy at the University of St. Thomas, which he chaired until his retirement in 2014. Before concluding my remarks on Mr. Durenberger, I'd just like to let all of you know that for my senior thesis project, I looked at sort of the Republican Party's name change. I'm sure he'll get into that a little bit. And at the very end of that paper, I actually got to look at Mr. Durenberger's race in 1978, when he was first elected to the Senate. So it's a very distinct privilege and honor of mine to be here introducing him today. Thank you.
Wow. That almost took the words right out of my mouth.
Yeah, the Independent Republican Party of Minnesota. Yeah, that was.
How does it feel to be a guy that history students are now studying?
Yeah, right. Well, we're on the right place at the right time, I guess. I'm just going to make a few remarks about the importance of our being here and your being here as well. And it relates to sort of the book, but it also relates in part to these young people that were up here introducing themselves, and particularly the last one that makes a reference to how he would invest himself in his staking a grade or something like that on getting it right when you talk about when Republicans had an independent Republican Party. But I told Lori I just wanted to start the meeting, as I've gotten used to doing this for the last couple of times, by first making reference to the fact that because it's the DFL governor that's talking about one Minnesota doesn't mean we Republicans are just as much a part of one Minnesota as everybody else. In fact, it's an invitation to those of us who are members of or part of a more conservative or a more liberal, a more progressive, or more whatever you want to call it, tradition, to think about who we are. And in an audience like this, I can say, you know, who you grew up to be. I have a picture of the Mefferts and their children and their grandchildren, which I will treasure because I've known them as I grew up in politics. I have a grandson out of 14 grandkids. The first one decided to go to St. John's, where I grew up in the middle of the Holy Land in Stearns County, Minnesota. And I can't help driving out here with Lori. Fortunately, she drives and I make comments about every community we go through. The memories come back, and today the opportunity to be with you comes back. And I don't have to tell anybody in this room that politics and other things have contributed to dividing this state in ways that make us uncomfortable. You know, whether we're on the right, the left, the blue, the red, whatever it is, we're not really comfortable with it. And part of that is attributable to what's happened to our sources of information about each other and about politics or about our leaders or whatever the case may be. And somebody reminded me the other day that when I got out of the Senate in 1995, there was only one cable news network, and that was CNN, you know? And there was no Facebook, and there was no, you know, you can go through this list. There wasn't any of that. And now a lot of that's for sale in one way or another. And it makes it hard. It makes it hard for these young people to grow up to be what they want to be or what they were meant to be in the families that helped them grow up. And we're like that all over the state of Minnesota. My favorite way of looking at one Minnesota is one Minnesota, a natural resource. And you can't help driving out here from the Twin Cities because you're going through the natural resource all the time. Half of it's underwater right now, but you know what I mean. And if I go up north, you know, I'm going into timber country or I'm going into paper country or whatever the case may be. And then there's Southwest State University. And then there's, you know, you can think about this, a natural resource, any way you want to look at it. And it's who we are. And it isn't just where we came from and how we were raised up, but it's how we put ourselves into being Minnesotans over time. And we were up in Duluth Thursday night, and I was reminded because I launched my career in doing good elected in 78 and 1980. By taking on Jimmy Carter, who had imposed an embargo on the Russians for going into Afghanistan, which just killed the farm industry. I mean, anybody who was trying to ship out of the Seaway Port of Duluth and get to Eastern markets or to get to European markets was just like that. And I did it, I'm a brand new senator, and I did an amendment on the budget bill that year. They had to pass the budget bill. I got an amendment on it that got rid of the embargoes. And Don Leslie, who's still in Minnesota, he's a now soybean farmer mainly up in northwestern Minnesota, will never stop telling me that Minnesota farmers owe me billions of dollars because I got this thing passed. Well, billions, schmillions. The point is, why do you run for office? If you're from Minnesota, you run for office to solve problems that Minnesotans have and then to take their ideas about how we could do this better to Washington, D.C. So when our governor's around the state talking about one Minnesota, or when he's in Washington with a divided legislature talking about one Minnesota, you know what he means. And you know what's at stake here. You know what's at stake here. I'm a small town boy as you can get because I grew up in Collegeville. But I once had a grand uncle who was mayor of this town, I think in the mid 1930s, August. And the McGuire families are all shirt-tail relatives. They all came out of Le Sueur and so forth. But we all came from someplace, and some of us ended up, fortunately, and because of you, in places where we could make a difference. And sometimes it meant, running your co-op or help running your co-op, and sometimes it meant taking on a new energy source, and sometimes it meant having to make choices about selling your farm or not. And you know what I mean? It just makes a huge, huge difference. So the point of this book, and this is what we will talk about, is that for the first time, two people have written about the history of the meaningful history of Republicans in Minnesota. It's never been written before. Lori's already been introduced as an author of a book on, they didn't mention Elmer Anderson, Governor Anderson, George Pillsbury, they did mention. But no one has ever tried to describe who Republicans are in Minnesota until we wrote this book. And we focused ourselves not on the ancient history, because if you go all the way back to 1860, when Alexander Ramsey became our governor, there's a whole series of conservative Republicans. But by the time we got to the Depression, people needed something different. And that was a 31-year-old governor from South St. Paul by the name of Harold Stassen. And he's succeeded by Luther Youngdahl. And it goes on through this history, which we'll talk a little bit about, because it's what brought us to write the book. But the main point in even launching on this one Minnesota tone is that everything I ever did, I did with Democrats of any significance. That's the only way you get things done. You do reach across the aisle is a overused phrase because it's who you grow up with. It's who you grow up with, who you get to know. And when you get to know people, it's really, really hard to say, I'm not going to vote with you because you're a Democrat or because you're a Republican. And so that's kind of like the groundwork, I guess. We're one America. Call us by a slogan, call us whatever it is. You can't deny the fact we're one America. But we're different states, we're different people, different backgrounds, and we're getting more different all the time. And we're even realizing that we were different before all these white guys came here from Europe. So look, we're just doggone lucky that some of us ended up being able to put that into a context of real American history. And it's all yours. It's Minnesota history.
Well, thank you, Dave, for that good summary to get us going here of what we were about. And I want to add my thanks to Southwest Minnesota State University for hosting us today. Dave was commenting about his family's ties directly to Marshall. I can't boast any of those things, but I can say that I'm the great-granddaughter of a fellow who settled down by Trimont, Minnesota, right after the Civil War and had 15 kids. My grandfather was the youngest. And so I didn't know that great-grandfather or the grandfather. He was already gone by the time I came along, but that family rootedness of the Sturdivant family in southwestern Minnesota goes way, way back. I grew up in Del Rapids, South Dakota, and so I'm connected to some of the places that you mentioned today. Jake, I think my brother lives not too far from where your parents live in Sioux Falls. So it's good to be here, and it's good to talk about what I hope is more than an exercise in nostalgia. David and I are both at an age where we're talking about, when we talk about the Republican Party in the last half of the 20th century, we're talking about a party that I covered and Dave was a participant in, and so I imagine there's a little nostalgia in there someplace. But mostly what we are talking about is a time when we think government worked well, and we're concerned that government really isn't working so well now. And so we are hoping that history can be a guide, a template to look back analytically, decide what went well and why it did go so well, what has changed, and what might be amended still to make government serve us all as we wish it would. Minnesotans are a people from way, way back, even from the era prior to the one that we describe. Minnesotans are people who value government and want it done well, want it done without corruption or dishonesty, want it to serve the broad needs of the people. And people ask us, why is this book entitled When Republicans Were Progressive? That word progressive now is used a lot about liberal, the most liberal Democrats. But that's not where that term came from. It first arose in American politics about 110 or 120 years ago with the Republican Party's response, a movement within the Republican Party, its response to the Gilded Age, to the era of capitalism running so far amok in many people's minds that it was hurting average people, that small business people, farmers, average working people were not being well served. And it was an attempt to bring the voices of the people more to bear in government through a variety of reforms. We would argue, I think, that term progressive, that the progressives of that era, the Robert La Follett's and the Theodore Roosevelt's, inspired Harold Stassen, who was the founder of the movement that we describe beginning in 1938, and that continues to have relevance as we think now about many people's concern that the average people are not being well served by the way that our society is running, and that government could be still improved as a tool to help the people work its will. So Dave, maybe you can comment a little bit about the origin of this book and the reasons that you appreciated the term progressive as a choice for our title.
Sure. I didn't want to write a book, but Russ Fridley, who was the executive director of the Minnesota Historical Society for a long time, called me up just shortly before he died in 2010 and said he wanted to have breakfast. And the point of the breakfast was to say that I was supposed to write a book on the history of Minnesota Republicans. And when I asked him, why would I do that? This was back in 2010 when, for the second straight Democratic president, Republicans nationally had sworn to make Barack Obama a one-term president. Before that, the same gang had sworn to make Clinton a one-term president. You don't get good policy out of something like that, but that was the reality. And I said, why would I write a book about him? And he said, because there's a heck of a lot more to the Republican Party than that. But I still wasn't convinced until about 2015, 16, something like that. And I said, I can't do it without somebody who really knows what they're doing. That's when the amazing Lori Sturdivant was available to me. But what Fredley was talking about is the connection between me and Harold Stassen, because I was in his law firm. I ended up knowing Harold Stassen, but I clearly wasn't in his law firm in 1938 when he started it, because I was 4 years old, or when he got out of it because he got elected governor. But I was Harold Levander's partner. And when Harold Levander got elected in 1966, in that election, I had worked on his election, and he saw that I knew more. He told me I knew more about politics than he did. So he said, would you be my chief of staff or executive secretary? So I went with Harold, and what we had in 1967 was a 2/3 conservative majority in the House and almost 2/3 in the Senate. By the way, the Minnesota State Senate had been from 1913 until 1973 conservative.
It goes further than that.
Right.
They've been conservative since statehood.
Since statehood?
Yes.
Look at that. Okay. So, Levander gets elected. The leadership of the House and the Senate come to South St. Paul and say, what do you want us to do? And Harold Levander says, pass the party platform. What? Pass the party platform? Wow. Well, he did. They did. Over almost 2/3 of the Republican Party platform got passed into law in that 1967 session. And it was some firsts. First time we had a pollution control agency. We dealt with the environmental issues, starting with water, and eventually we got to air, but it was called the Pollution Control Agency. And Gordon Rosenmeyer made sure it wasn't in the Department of Health, where he thought it would get lost. It would be an independent department. The nation's first Department of Human Rights, a Department of Labor and Industry. Not just the labor, not just industry, but labor and industry. The Met Council, the Metropolitan Sewage System. Republicans were anticipating the fact that people were moving out of the Minneapolis-St. Paul and they're moving out to the townships and converting those townships into cities, and that the cities, you're going to have to, this growth is going to keep happening, and we're going to have to anticipate that and do something about it. And so, again, as Lori said earlier, you don't get elected with a specific plan as to what to do about it, but you get elected to set up a structure that of people who are either elected or appointed who can determine what you need to do about it. And so I just gave you a few examples that were in that party platform, but that launched me, into a career, because I ended up after Harold left with Elmer Anderson, but it was a career that you always think about what people are capable of when presented with a problem. If you identify a problem for people in rural areas that is being experienced in the metropolitan area, and you show them the linkage between their interest and the interest of those people, they'll help you find the answer to it. Transportation right now, infrastructure, whatever you want to call it, is one of those examples. But that's what I learned in this little 4-year experience that has just shaped my whole direction from then on.
I sometimes say that the change in Minnesota's Republican Party is the biggest story I covered at the Star Tribune in my 43 years there. But I had to tell it in increments of one legislative session or one convention or one election at a time. And the writing of this book gave me a chance to write it with the sweep of decades, so thank you for that opportunity, Senator. Dave just described to you some of the achievements of the Republican-controlled legislature of the late 1960s and the Republican governor that you served, Harold Levander. And just think about how different that legislature's mindset was and how different in composition it was. The mid-60s was when redistricting finally resumed in Minnesota. For 55 years, Minnesota's legislature was not properly redistricted. And then the federal court said, thou shall, and made it happen. And so beginning with the 1967 session, the metropolitan area was represented as it should have been all along. And that was represented largely by Republicans. Today's Republican Party is largely absent from the central cities and is increasingly endangered in the suburbs. That's one difference. That Republican Party in 1967, over the governor's veto, instituted Minnesota's first state sales tax. And it was vetoed by the Republican governor, not on the no new taxes basis, but because he thought a major tax policy change like that should have been taken to a referendum of the people. The notion of referenda being an old progressive Republican idea from the early part of the 20th century. He lost that fight, but nevertheless, that was the origin of our state's sales tax. And the purpose of the sales tax was to help fund education and local governments. An idea called revenue sharing was in vogue and was much promoted by Governor Levander and by Dave Durnberger at the staff meetings he would go to. That idea became the core of what was called the Minnesota Miracle in 1971. Still in a lot of memory credited to DFL Governor Wendell Anderson. People don't remember that Wendell Anderson in 1971 worked with a Republican-controlled or conservative-controlled legislature in that year. And it was a conservative legislature that put those revenue-sharing ideas into law. Dave mentioned the emphasis on pollution control and environmental protection. Those were very much Republican ideas there, less so today. He mentioned the creation of the Minnesota Human Rights Department to advance the cause of civil rights. That was very much, Dave, you often mention how the state party chair, Bob Forsyth, had to miss a meeting once with his DFL counterpart because he was marching that weekend in Selma, Alabama on the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
It's a Republican chair of the
Minnesota
Republican Party of
chair
Minnesota.
did that, yes. The Metropolitan Council has been a whipping boy by the state Republican Party in Minnesota for the last decade or so. I think the last gubernatorial candidate said it was his intention to dismantle the Met Council as one of his first acts, not acknowledging that the Metropolitan Council, as designed and as instituted today, was a Republican creation in 1967. So what a change we've seen, and it's that arc we described from Harold Stassen in 1938 to the end of the Durenberger's career in the U.S. Senate in 1994 that we describe in our book. And Dave, while your leaving the U.S. Senate is important, let's acknowledge that the reason we chose to end our story in 1994 was more because a sitting popular Republican governor, Arne Carlson, was denied endorsement by his own party. That year, the party endorsed a fellow named Alan Quist, a former state representative from St. Peter, who had been quite a crusader on the anti-abortion and anti-gay rights cause. And that endorsement was so unusual that it brought in national press attention. They wondered why a state party would turn its back on one of its own, a sitting popular governor. Well, the voters went with Arne. Arne got a second term, but nevertheless, it was a sign of how the Republican Party had shifted away from the progressive ideas that had animated the party from 1938 forward. Dave, say a little bit about then your role. You were not in elected office until 1978, an election called the Minnesota Miracle, and it was the result, in fact,
massacre.
Oh, pardon me, Minnesota Massacre. I got the wrong M there. Minnesota Massacre.
Somebody in this audience got wiped out because of that.
Yeah, I believe that to be true. I believe that was true. And it came shortly after Minnesota's Republican Party had changed its name, and that was of interest to one of our students. Say a little bit about the attitudes of the Minnesota Republican Party as you enter elective office, and who were those independent Republicans anyway?
Sure. When we think about why did we call ourselves independent, it was in large part a reaction to the fact that at the national level, the Republican Party was changing. And the Republican Party, instead of being a broad-based party, began to do two things. Number one, they began to push the issues that were important towards the middle, or not towards the middle, but they moved it to what we call the political right, where certain issues became the ones that would determine an election, one or two or three issues, rather than the quality of the people involved. But the second thing that was going on behind the scenes of all of this was the Republican determination to take over the South, or the way they thought about it, take back the South. Take back the South. And that was done on purpose, and it was done at the national level, and it's what we now have, that the kinds of issues that, you don't even have to get into the detail of this, except to say, I know how it started, because I served with, of all the senators I served with when I got there in 1979, the one that I came to disrespect the most was the one by the name of Jesse Helms from North Carolina. He was a one-issue senator, and that was, I'm going to decide how we run this country. Even Jim Baker and Ronald Reagan. Jim Baker was chief of staff to Ronald Reagan. Then he was secretary of the Secretary of State. Even they didn't have the power to take on Jesse Helms when it came to, are you appointing communists to be ambassadors in South America or in El Salvador or wherever the case may be. So it started with, that was my first part of the experience, but after that it became the vote on motor voting. All right? The South didn't want people to be able to, when they went to register for an automobile license or something like that, and they have to produce evidence of where they live and so forth, to also register to vote. The fewer people voting, the better. And this is just, that's why I started out by talking about where I got raised up versus where some of my colleagues got raised up, because that was part of the reality of the subtle change that was taking place in the National Republican Party and defining issues that became more and more, quote, popular. You can now toss in no new taxes. You can toss in the NRA and all. Oliver North came back. My God, Colonel Oliver North came back, the Iran-Contra guy, fighting over who's going to run the NRA. But I don't say this with disrespect for any Republicans from any part of the country, but I say it because I lived it. I lived it. When Ronald Reagan became President of the United States, there were, for the first time, we had 54 Republican votes in the United States Senate. And of those 54, 17 would be called progressives because of the states that they came from and the people that they were. And so if Reagan was going to get anything done, he had to get some number of the 17 senators. And the way those 17 senators operated, that meant they could reach across their aisles to, in my case, Russell Long, my chairman of the Finance Committee, which is Taxes and Trades from Louisiana, or even Strom Thurmond from South Carolina on the issues that I worked with Strom on. So you had to do some reaching to get your what you needed for your own people done. And here's how Reagan would react, and this is straight from Bob Dole's mouth. And he said whether it was Howard Baker was the Senate leader or Bob Dole was the Senate leader, they occasionally would have to call up the president and say, "We haven't got the votes, sorry." And Ronald Reagan would always react the same way. He would say, "Oh, Howard, that's all right. Don't sweat it." He said, we're batting 71% or 72%, and that's not half bad. Think of what it would be if you had an optimist as president of the United States like Ronald Reagan was. That optimistic, that positive, Was he more conservative than lots of other people? Sure. But in here, he was a positive man who saw not only a vision for himself, like we're getting used to now, but a vision for the country. And he could bring all kinds of people into sharing that vision. And that's how we ran the Senate during that period of time.
Well, one of the things that actually impressed me, Dave, is working with you on this book was the extent to which you would identify Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush, Papa Bush, as part of this progressive Republican line. Many people today see Ronald Reagan as the conservative warrior coming to the fore and changing the Republican Party. That's not quite how you saw him. Say a little bit about the ways in which you see Ronald Reagan as part of the tradition of making government work that progressives were all about in those years.
Sure. And I think the first part of that is what I've just said, which is it'll work if, in fact, the leader can inspire, can get you inspired. Then you trust them. And the one thing that I tell people when they say, as they used to say a lot, when I was closer to retirement and so forth, they would say, I didn't always agree with you, but I trusted you. That's why I vote for you. Can you say that today? People trusted Ronald Reagan. They didn't always agree with him. And sometimes we didn't always agree with him, as I told you, with the 70% average. But when everybody is harnessed with trust in some fashion, you keep this train moving. You keep going, and you get through the rough spots. And there were things that Ronald Reagan, did in 1981 that we had to undo in 1982, like cutting the heck out of taxes when the country's going to heck in a handbasket and so forth. But then he came back very positively after that, and particularly working with Tip O'Neill and with Danny Rostenkowski on the House side, we ended up passing tax bills, plural, the last of which was in 1986, which had effectively cut the marginal rate of income taxation for individuals from 70% to 28%. Can you believe that? So that's what a combination of trust by the Democrats as well as the Republicans, Northerners as well as Southerners, conservatives as well as liberals, will do. Because progress is what you're interested in. You want to keep moving. How do you keep the economy going? How do you keep it getting healthier and healthier and healthier? There were tough times in the ag economy in 83, 84, 85. A lot of you still remember the people that went belly up in that period of time. But we came back from that. It was something we had to go through, and we came back from that. A lot of you remember the days when there were lots of trains around here. But some people fought for short line trains, and so at least we kept people connected with each other. And I'm just full of these kinds of examples, but the common denominator through all of this, Lori, is leadership and a trusting followership, if you will. Because every time I go to the polls and I've got Republican after my name, somebody who might be a Democrat might say, well, I'm not sure I want to think, well, but your choice is Mark Dayton, or your choice is Skip Humphrey, or, whatever the case may be. And they had to have a lot of confidence to abandon their base and come with me. But as several of you have complimented me on already, they knew me, in a sense. They knew me, and so did the president.
We talk a lot in the book about the Minnesota ideas and values you took to Washington and tried to bring to national policy. And that, of course, is what, as we point out in the book, that's the way the Senate is supposed to work. Russell Long told you, when every state is heard from, we will have good national policy. And Dave was trying to represent Minnesota values with regard to voting rights, with regard to civil rights, with regard to the environment. And your signature issue, it was health care. And it was actually, we tell the story in the book of how your work on health care both moved the needle, had some successes during the Bush and Reagan years, and then really began to hit a roadblock, not just from Democrats, but from your own party in 1993 and 1994, your last years in the Senate. Why don't you spend a little time talking about what begins to go wrong with the effort to carry Minnesota's values forward in that period?
Sure. And the same thing applies to the environment. Most public policy gets made. People make recommendations in the White House, but then the policy gets made in the committees, and then it bubbles up from the committees to the floor of the Senate. And in all the time that I was on the Senate Finance Committee, and I had responsibility for Medicare and Medicaid and all the health related programs, plus a lot of other things like that. But my Democratic co-chair or depending on what it was, either the vice chair or I was the vice chair to his chair, so forth, was always a colleague. Max Baucus from Montana was one, then Jay Rockefeller was another, and so forth. And we always worked together. A lot of ideas came out of Minnesota, and they were new to a West Virginian, or they were new to a Montanan or something like that. But we spent enough time digesting what I thought was the next best step for the Medicare program and so forth. So they would adapt it. And we would then go to the House and take on a couple of more liberal Democrats who wanted to do more government and more this and more that. And I'm more the market side, and how do we make the market work and things like that. And we had to be apolitical or non-political in order to win. And we did win, because we knew what we were talking about. And they had confidence in me because I had confidence in the people in Minnesota who planted all of these ideas in my head at that same time. But the value of that, no politics in this, rubs off on lots of other related issues, because people get to know you and they get to understand, you understand where we're going, not just how to get from here to a piece of legislation, but you have a context in which you do these sort of things. And so the same thing could apply to lots of other issues that we got into. But I want to say one thing about you mentioned Papa Bush. Democrats took over the Senate in 1986. So from 1986 to the end of my term in '94, and at the end of George H.W. Bush's term, Democrats control the Senate and they control the House. Now that's a big deal. That's a great opportunity if you want to be partisan. In the Senate, George Mitchell was the Democratic leader. George Mitchell came in to replace Ed Muskie, and George and I were on at least 2 or 3 committees together. We got to know each other really, really well. What I got to know about George Mitchell, even though he was the party chairman Democratic Party chairman in Maine, was that George felt that his job was to help get things done, whoever the president was. George also believed that it was more important for a Democrat in the Senate, to a Democrat in the Senate, that he have a Republican like Bush signature on a piece of legislation than that it be the perfect liberal answer to a problem. And I give people 3 illustrations of that. One is the Clean Air Act in 1990. Another one was the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was humongously historic. Another one was motor voting. Again, the civil rights issue. And so what George Mitchell did, he had 3 of us, and I mentioned those 3 because I was on those 3 committees. He had 3 of us plus 3 Democrats sitting in his office along with George Bush's staff, and we would hammer out, and ahead of going to the Senate floor, we'd hammer out the details of what we wanted that bill to be. And then the 6 of us, whoever else the Senate would designate, we'd go to battle with the House and we'd win. And we'd come back with the same bill. And I love telling people about what happened in July of 1990 when the George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I almost always get a little choked when I talk about this, but we're out on the lawn in front of the White House, maybe 1,000 people sitting out there, and Hail to the Chief gets played, and out comes the President of the United States. And as the President comes out and they play Hail to the Chief, half the audience stands up. You got it, right? And the other half is yelling, "Down in front!" I got to say that's one of the happiest moments of my life. And so it was to those people who were yelling down in front, because they knew what that meant. There was no politics in this. It was a Republican president working, across the aisle and across a lot of other challenges to business and people like that who said, you can't do this, you can't do that. But because it was a Republican president, and it was Republicans in the Senate who supported that, we've got this kind of historic legislation. The last thing I will say is, when I left the Senate in 1994, at the end of 1994, there was one climate denier on the Republican side, Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma, who's still there. Today, every one of them is a climate denier. You can't tell me that quickly, either the science turned, or just people changed their mind or something like that. That's totally partisan. So you need to know that to understand we're not bad guys because we're progressives. We're like reflectors. We absorb what we hear and what we learn and what we understand, not only from our constituents, but from the people we work with who represent other kinds of people in other parts of the country. But what a Republican does is look for a way not to have the government take over an issue, but to have the government ideally just set the rules so that the private sector can deliver whatever it does best. And that in itself is a huge challenge.
Well, people ask us then, Dave, what went wrong? What changed? I shouldn't maybe put the pejorative what went wrong, but what changed so that progressive Republicans sort of disappear from our ballots, at least in Minnesota and most of the rest of the country, and they certainly have disappeared from the U.S. Senate, as you pointed out. And we talk about some of those changes, of course, in the media, the social rise of social issues, and the religious changes in the party politic, how religious groups became more active in politics in the 1980s. That's part of the story. Part of the story is a change in the congressional lifestyle. I'll ask you to comment about that in a moment because it disrupted that relationship building. But in a nutshell, I would say that, and this is a change I've observed at the Minnesota legislature as well, it used to be clear that politics was a means to an end, and the end was good governance. Someone like Roger Moe, a good long name in Minnesota legislative circles, would always say to us that good policy will lead to good politics. Pay attention to the policy, get the policy right, and the politics will sort of take care of itself. And Roger made that work, by the way. In 22 years, he only lost 3 incumbent DFL senators. That's remarkable. Today, it appears that instead of politics being a means to an end, it appears that in the minds of many of our politicians, politics is the end. It's the end in itself. And what has arisen is a major industry of well-funded people. I sometimes call it the political industrial complex. A lot of people in this country are paid a lot of money to keep Americans divided from one another, to perpetuate some of our long simmering fights, so that they can be ready for the next election rather than to really move the needle to solve problems as people in your era would have tried to do. I asked you to comment about the change in the congressional lifestyle and what difference that has made. Why don't you tell a little bit about that?
Sure. As you're suggesting by your comments, the first thing that's important to understand about the Senate that I knew is that a whole lot of us didn't have to be there. I mean, the people I served with 2 astronauts. I served with 2 World War II heroes that happened to be in rehab in Detroit together, one a Democrat and one a Republican. I served with the former CEOs of large companies. I walked down the aisle one day with Jack Danforth from Missouri, who was in a January 1st beginning session with Jack Danforth from Missouri, who was the heir to the Ralston Purina fortune. And he pointed down there, and there's a big tall guy standing down in the well of the Senate. And it was Jay Rockefeller, who was a brand new senator from West Virginia, and he says, "I'm no longer the richest guy in the Senate." Oh, I could go through this with stories about a guy like Dick Lugar, who just died. I mean, most of these people didn't have to be in the Senate to be somebody. That was number one. And I think that's a really important part of it. And second thing is, I packed four sons in the back of a car and went to Washington, D.C. in a snowstorm. And my kids grew up with everybody else's kids. We all grew up together. On the floor of the Senate on the day that one of my sons was going to graduate, Dick Lugar's son was going to graduate too. But Teddy Kennedy on a Saturday had a big bill on the floor that he wanted to win. And we wanted to be across the street at the commencement. And Ted Kennedy said, "I won't take any votes until you guys get back. You put this off." That's seems like a really little thing, but it tells you how close people become to each other when they're both carrying the same kind of burden, but, from different communities. And the first thing that Newt Gingrich and Dick Cheney and Phil Gramm and the guys from the South, basically, who put us on the party on the course that we're on today, the first thing they did when they won with that Contract for America in 1995 was tell people to leave your families at home. We'll guarantee you that you don't have to work more than 2 nights a week, maybe 3 weeks out of the month, and maybe 8 or 9 months out of the year. Boy, just think about that in terms of your own businesses and your own community and everything that you do. It can't possibly. It isn't just about the fact they then ended up having to spend all their time raising money. It's the relationship thing, which is so critically important. My kids went to school with Jimmy Hagedorn in Langley High School. Okay, they didn't get the vote for him because they don't live in his district, but they went to school with him. And a final thing that really is important when you get to know each other well enough, and I just call it faith, because I'm not getting into the institutional thing. But everybody understands how important a personal faith is, and people express it in different ways. But every week, the Senate has a prayer breakfast. I mean, it's just 25 people usually, on average. Democrats, Republicans get together, and they talk real personally about their lives and their families and a bunch of things like that. And one of them, in my last term, they asked me to go around the world and talk to leaders in other parts of the world. And in the book, I talk about relationships with King Hussein in Jordan, who carried my business card in his pocketbook or whatever it was when he was at the Mayo Clinic. I found that out from his wife. And I can tell you stories about Rajiv Gandhi and Benazir Bhutto, Pakistan and India, and about what they did every time their armies were shooting at each other up in Kashmir. One of them would call the other and say they're at it again. But you ask them, why do they behave that way? And it's because they feel people that they represent. They might be Buddhist, they might be Hindu, they might be Shia, they might be Islam, or they might be Christian. And I could go to talk to them about Jesus. And in the beginning, they used to ask me, which Jesus you want to talk about? Because you come from America, they see all these different Jesuses, the whatever. But then they start talking about what does it mean to believe in Jesus? Whether you believe him as a great prophet or whatever. They start talking about the meaning of that. That's what I mean by faith. And I add that to the book only because right now that's one of the things that seems to be dividing us. And there's a presumption, I know certainly on the part of the current president, keep the Muslims out of the country or something like that. He's missing the point. We all miss the point. We all miss the point. At heart, we all have a special need to have a personal faith. And if we can found it on a traditional religion as a source, fine. But it doesn't make any difference if it's this one or this one or this one or this one or this one. Do you have that? Do you have where that faith is designed to lead you? So that seemed to be important to the book because I know that's who you are. That's who we are. And if we're going to reclaim our destiny, if you will, or our potential, I put it that way, Lori, those are the kinds of people you want to look for. Not the one issue, not the one issue person.
Maybe you can tell that Dave grew up at St. John's University. And I grew up in the Star Tribune, and so Dave, when you work on a book with an editorial writer, you get an editorial in there somewhere. And our book includes some possible prescriptions for change. One of them Dave alludes to as he talks about how members of Congress really don't live together anymore. We think that is something that ought to be changed with reform of the congressional calendar. Getting more time actually to work on legislation and work on those relationships and less time spent fundraising would be good. Campaign finance reform would be good, but it's something that is difficult given the position the Supreme Court has taken. Our favorite idea for reform is ranked choice voting. And I don't know if you are as familiar with ranked choice voting here in southwestern Minnesota as we are in the Twin Cities, but both Minneapolis and St. Paul now have used it for about a decade in municipal elections, and there's an effort in the legislature to make it easier for more municipalities around the state to adopt it. To give it a try, to get used to the idea that if you have a ballot with multiple candidates, you can rank first choice, second choice, third choice. And you can then express, if your first choice candidate is someone who comes in actually toward the bottom of the finishers in an election, your ballot will be re-examined for your second choice, and your ballot will be directed to that second choice candidate, thereby sparing you the feeling that you might accidentally be helping to elect the candidate you like the least. Among the side benefits, or the ancillary benefits of ranked choice voting, is that it encourages more people to get involved, and it encourages the development of consensus. It discourages negative campaigning. When you are seeking not only first choice but second choice votes from the voters, you're a little less likely to bash your opponents because you want the people who think highly of your opponents to make you their second choice. That helps, that it changes the nature of campaigns. It allows for multiple candidates, but it gets us back to majority rule. And minority rule has been a problem in not only in Minnesota, but throughout the country. We deprive democracy of legitimacy when we lapse into minority rule. And so we talk about that as well. We also talk a lot about the opportunity for people at the local level to continue to make government work. And we see lots of examples of that. I suspect you see those examples here in Marshall as well. And so we'd like to actually hear from you about that. We'd like to hear some of your ideas, your reflections on the progressive Republican era in Minnesota politics, and your thoughts about where we are now and where we go from here. So at this point, we'd like to open it up for questions. And Anita, is there a microphone we're going to pass around, or are we just going to talk loudly?
No, we have a microphone.
Have a microphone, okay? So wait, please, until the microphone comes, and you can direct your question to Senator Dernberger or to me or to both of us, whichever you'd like to do. Here's a hand right here to get us started.
Thank you both. Laurie, I've read your column frequently, and Senator Dernberger, you and I have indirectly crossed paths. I started my teaching career at St. John's University, and you're the only Republican I ever voted for.
I like that path.
We get that a lot, don't we, Dave? We get that a lot.
But my question is for Senator Dernberger, because of your particular position in the Senate. This is a question on foreign policy. What obligation do we have towards the northern tier in Central America, the three countries that are mostly providing the refugee crisis at our border? What connection is there between our foreign policy in Central America in the 1980s with today's refugee crisis, in your estimation?
Okay, I guess you all heard the question, and in the period of time that I was in the Senate from 1978 on, the liberation theology was beginning to capture some of the traditional Catholic church of the all of the people in Central America and some of the northern tier countries in South America, and that wasn't appreciated, if you put it that way, by the American business interests that really pretty much controlled both the agriculture development in those areas and the products that got shipped out of there and so forth. And so we got into this hassle that got me directly involved, more so than when I was at H.B. Fuller Company, and we owned a company called Cativo Chemicals, which was the biggest company in each of the Central American states. But interestingly, what it did was bring me in touch with the leadership in each of those countries. And I discovered two things. Number one was how important recognizing them as people, their institutions, their people, that sort of thing, how important that was from the gringos in the United States. And to the degree that they practiced our form of democracy like Costa Rica did in 1948, you had an example for everybody else that wanted to follow it. But the following was delayed by the control of the sort of the oligarchs, if you will, that had each of those other countries. So that was my challenge, was to stop Reagan basically from, mining the harbors in Nicaragua and doing a bunch of other foolish things like that. You ask it in today's context?
Yeah, the
it's
connection
yep.
between maybe that intervention in the 80s versus the kind of chaos that exists in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador.
Yeah, and I always just say it doesn't exist in Costa Rica. So it's all a leadership issue. So then you ask the question, what's the United States role? And the United States role should have been, for a long period of time, building up and recognizing by, just how you work that on international relations, building up the capacity of free institutions, newspapers, radio, whatever it is, plus the church and all the other influential, are build up their capacity. And you do that has to become an important part of your foreign policy and your international relations and your trade policy. You have to have leaders who will recognize that. And in this country, I think my opinion is that once we overcame the challenges of the Contras, went through Iran-Contra, we started forgetting about them again. And that the solution today is we got to get back to it. You got to get back to it, because as long as people have a way to get away from, and then I could go into opioids and I could go into drugs, things like that. But the biggest thing is relational. If you lose your interest as soon as your guy wins, or you win, and then you go away, And that's what the Chinese don't give a damn about. You know, they'll do business with anybody, this sort of thing. We'll do business with them, but we also got a stake in it. And you're illustrating the stake.
Who else has a question?
Thanks, Anita. Senator, I'm a lifelong Republican, although I do claim to have crossed the aisle a handful of times. My father-in-law in 1990 ran as a representative for the Minnesota House, so I felt obligated to vote for him. I voted for Perpich when he was running. He was out of office at the time, running against Arnie Carlson, right? I believe. And I'm one of a handful of Republicans in Minnesota who did not vote for Trump. All right. Overall, I consider myself to be quite conservative, though. So my question for you, you mentioned. You use the term climate denier. So when it comes to issues such as climate change, poverty, and healthcare, among others, people on the left, whether they call themselves socialists or progressives or liberals or Democrats, whatever, will often use moral imperatives to support their cause, right? They'll use the term, this is a moral certitude, right? That we need to do this. Why is it when conservatives address the issue of abortion that we're told that no, you can't impose your morality on us?
I'm going to give you an oversimplified answer, which is because it comes at the average person as an all or nothing deal. This is my issue. This is my issue. I'm through with you if you don't support me. I mean, it becomes basically it becomes a cause, and I only just refer to my experience as a pro-life person with my entry into the Senate when I found out that Jim Oberstar, who was also pro-life, and Henry Hyde, who's also extremely pro-life, in the House had already put together a bipartisan coalition that would support no federal funds for abortion. And that's the way we operated during most of the time that I was there. But during the course of that, it became an excuse for the people who advocate against abortion as a moral right to classify me as worthy of an office that I think I have earned, for a lot of other reasons. And one of my closest experience in answering your question was on funding Planned Parenthood. You take this attitude and you apply it to Planned Parenthood because they also have abortion clinics. Oh, you can't fund Title X. I voted to fund Title X. And of course, I became the wishy-washy. That's how you can take a moral issue, and either side can do this. I'm not just saying it's all Republicans and it's all on the issue of abortion. There's plenty of people that aren't going to vote for this Buttigieg because he's gay. There's plenty of Franklin Grahams in the world that are going to condemn people that declare how they view marriage. Okay? We're full of that sort of stuff, and everybody will. Pardon me. I don't want to mischaracterize it because I think most moral issues are deeply, deeply held. But I'm saying in politics and in public policy making, you have to recognize that if you make it a moral issue, you're up against a whole bunch of other people that define their morality with a different kind of an end to it when it comes to what should government policy be, and in a variety of ways. That's sort of like the bottom line of it. And it's what it is. And there are plenty of other examples other than, and so morality lies in a whole bunch of other things, like denying me a right to run for the Senate because I don't agree with you. To me, that violates. I don't. If you took that position, I'm not saying it. I think if you took that position, and you claim a moral right to keep me out of there, no way, buddy. No way. That's not why our forebears came from far distant lands and through revolutions, and all of us expose ourselves to the hate of this and the hate of that and all the rest of the things that go through it. We feel a moral obligation, if we have the ability to do it, to represent everybody we can. So, don't use the word, moral politics, whether you're on the left or you're on the right.
Well, but let me get in a little Minnesota historian lick on that. Some political scientists have characterized Minnesota's political culture for a long, long time as a moralistic culture. And in fact, some of the Stassen emphasis in 1938 against corruption and cronyism and under the table payments in farmer labor political circles, that helped propel Harold Stassen to victory. So there's been a strain of moralism in Minnesota politics for a long, long time. The question is whose morality and how do you evaluate that? Morals are not absolute.
Thank you for the courage to ask that question, because it's not an easy question to either to answer or to pose.
We found that politics are so unpopular. You can't speak politics at the coffee shops, and you set up your booth at the fair, and if you're one part or the other, nobody wants to stop. They might see you talking to a Democrat or a Republican, and we have a terrible time getting good qualified candidates to run for the Senate or any of the offices. Is there anything we can do to get good qualified candidates?
Sure, I think both of us can answer that. Maybe Lori better than I, but I was in Owatonna on Monday at the Rotary Club, and just before I was introduced, the woman who made the report on their Better Angels project, a University of Minnesota former head of the psychology department named Bill Doherty, who's now in his 70s in retirement, is now kind of a national figure because he has found a way, and they call it Better Angels, but it's a way to bring people that you're talking about who are the red or blue together to find their better angels. We all have them. There, you know that. The hardest part of what you just said is in a family. But even in a family, it's essential to somehow or other get to the better angel in us that gets allowed to speak to that other person. First to hear, then to understand, and then to relate by way of expression to that other person. You don't have to buy everything they're selling or whatever it is. You simply have to be able to express in a sincere way the fact that you care enough about them to listen and to take that in. And once you do that, then you start learning, they start learning, and so forth. And so that was the report, and that's the way we launched that day I think you can tell from this conversation that's we all feel the same thing, and if there's a reason for us for being here, it's just exactly the discomfort that people have. And I guess the last thing is, you know this too, because better than I, that it's at the local government level that mayors and county commissioners and people like that are really feeling this, because they ask you, why are you bringing that, why do you take that view? You know, we're just elected here to do the people's will, and it's some federal program or some state program or whatever, you know. And we're going to be on a panel, I think, at the League of Cities.
A few years ago, I was invited to speak, Dave, at a conference mostly of women, but a national conference. And the person right before me speaking was a political scientist who had presented statistics about how difficult it was to recruit women to run for office. And how women, when they run, typically do pretty well, often have a little bit of an advantage over men in many parts of the country, but have a hard time recruiting women to run. And then I got up and said, you know, I think this has something to do with negativity in campaigning, negative politics, and the battery people take online when they are in elective office. And all around the room, I saw heads nodding. We need to do something systemically to change the way we campaign. And that's one of the reasons I'm interested in ranked choice voting, quite frankly. I think it has an opportunity to tamp down some of the very hostile negative campaigning. Another thing we haven't talked about as much, but we can, is the nationalization of our local politics and our state politics. If you are in a highly contested legislative district in the state, you are the lucky recipient of way more folders, flyers in the mail than you want to see. There are many of them a national template accusing some new legislative candidate of being in favor of ISIS or some crazy thing. You know, it's always sort of outlandish, intended to instill fear, intended to bring out sort of the worst impulses in people, the kind of negative campaigning that turns people off. A lot of those flyers wind up immediately in the trash can, but they create an impression that, boy, this is an enterprise to avoid, this whole elective office. Why would I ever want to bother with that? That's a shame. We need good talent in elected officials.
In the early 1980s, the Minnesota Jaycees held their state convention in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And I was in that audience when you were the keynote speaker. And you spoke about the urgency of doing reform in healthcare. And when the Affordable Care Act was passed, which was basically a template from the Heritage Foundation, I was hopeful that we were going to start talking seriously and together about how we could fix healthcare. We're 30 years later and we haven't accomplished anything. In Minnesota, we're arguing about keeping a 2% provider tax to fund Minnesota Care, Medicaid, and those kinds of things. You have any insights on?
Yeah, well, God, you can tell by my expression. Yeah, no, I'm a JC president who, in my little town of South St. Paul, we won the Class 5 best chapter in the country way back in the early 60s sometime. So, but that speech that you're talking about in Sioux Falls is in a book that I wrote in 1986 called Prescription for Change, and it's got a variety of, it uses my speeches over 6 or 7 years to give a sense of direction, to answer your question. The best way to answer that question, because it's so difficult to comprehend how now we're at 19% of the gross national product is in healthcare. I mean, it so dwarfs everything else. Now that's why Amazon gets into the business, and United Health, and the drug companies and everybody else do as well as they do. So it makes it harder and harder and harder. But the key to answering your question is, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. And that's what we've been doing. I was guilty of that too. I mean, I was better than most people because I had a bunch of tutors in Minnesota, who taught me what we should be doing, or I wouldn't have had the guts to use that topic in Sioux Falls. But you got to have a sense of how this whole story ends. And mine does not end in Medicare for all. It does not end in Germany or Holland or England or any place like that. It ends in Minnesota, and hopefully from Minnesota to the rest of the country. Because the mistake from the beginning has been to pay for Medicare and Medicaid with the hospital insurance company called Blue Cross and the doctor insurance company called Blue Shield. and to pay them, the guarantee to pay hospitals and doctors whatever they charge. It's called reasonable and customary fees for services. So the issue is insurance. What's the point of insurance if you could actually buy a membership at Sanford Health or Mayo Health or somebody else like that, Allina Health, Fairview Health, Essentia Health, whatever it is. Not only might you encourage the development of other companies than Sanford, I don't know who else, where the line is drawn here in this part of the state, but the insurance function can be absorbed into the healthcare design and delivery function. That's part number one. And getting there, the state can do that. The state can just change the insurance rules and things like that to help you get. Will the opposition be? Oh God, will it be fierce? I mean, everybody who's making money off the current system is going to oppose it. So then the second part of this is to make it more attractive than it is today, and that's to ask the question: why do we have to decide every year what we're going to buy? Why don't you sell a 5-year membership? And if you can sell a 5-year membership, then the incentives on Sanford's Health is to keep that 5th-year price down low by keeping you healthy and not doing the surgery you don't need. And I don't want to describe my own, but I reach for my shoulder. And I thank God for 3 physical therapists, you know. And so why not a 5-year membership, you know? Belong, have a sense of belonging. And so these people are like, they're your partners in all of this. So the third part that is really important is illustrated by this book that's written by George Halverson, who used to run Health Partners, and then he ran Kaiser Permanente for 11 years out in California, the biggest of the HMOs. And George, when he was leaving Kaiser Permanente, was asked by the governor of California to head up the California Commission on Elementary Education. And in that, George discovered the importance of brain development, the science of brain development. And he wrote this little book called 3 Key Years: Talk, Read, Play, Sing to a Newborn for 30 minutes a day for the first 3 years of their life, and you got no learning problems. No learning problems. I heard George give this little talk in Franklin Avenue in Minneapolis, and most of the audience were women who worked with the tribal health organizations. And after 10 minutes of this talk, the first hand went up, and the person said, "That's the res. That's the res." And you can do that in almost any community in Minnesota. It won't say that's the res, but you can point out examples of the failure, our failure, to deal more realistically with the potential that every one of these little newborns has. And it isn't just a matter of read, sing, play, talk, and so forth. Then it carries over into the school systems. Well, how are we running our schools today? How many principals and how many other people that run schools these days are totally dedicated to helping somebody who may not ever show up at a PTA meeting or things like that to raise a kid? Are you really committed to raising kids? Or are you just there to meet the rules for this, and that? And that's possible. There are places in this nation where people do that. So the connection here is dealing with the social conditions in our communities. That's a health issue, but it's also education. And it crosses over a variety of these things. And if you've been, I can tell by the body language, if you've been in somewhere in the health professions, you kind of get that. And even if you want to make it your responsibility to help people who are with a preventable illness, you're going to be frustrated by the fact that you can't make any money doing that, you know, because the system doesn't reward it. If you're a frustrated teacher right now, and I've got at least one granddaughter coming along like that, you know, maybe you're not in the right system with the right focus. It isn't because your kid's can't read to you're teaching 5th grade and these kids can't read but to the 2nd grade. It's how did it ever get to that point in that school? It never should have gotten there. Never. You can't blame that one on the color of somebody's skin or their marriage, were they married when they decided to have a child, or any of those kinds of issues. These are serious social issues that are present in rural as well as urban communities, that we have institutions already that can, in addition to the churches or something, that can help us think about those sort of things. So thank you very much for the question.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more.
I was going to say one more question, and I see your hand up there, so I'm going to come over.
This is a non-political question. Here in Marshall, we've had a whole series of graduates of St. John's. We've had a whole series of graduates of St. John's University who've been wonderful public servants. They have a propensity and they have the skills necessary and the ethics necessary, it seems to me, to do a good job for humanity. What's in the water in Collegeville? I was going to say what happened. You're going to say what happened to you. I went to St. Olaf. So. St. Olaf? Yeah. Huh? Yeah. Are you St. Olaf? Yes. Yes. That's my favorite college. St. Olaf. Yeah. Yeah. Are you an Ole? Yeah. Well, St. John's is number 2.
We're at another campus. Remember that. Keep it in mind.
No, I know. But I got a grandson that's just starting up there, and I saw the president of the university the other night at an event honoring the potter, Richard Bresnahan, and I went up to him and I grabbed him and to hug him, and I said, "You just admitted my grandson," and I got all choked up because I realized what that kid had no idea what that decision was going to mean to him. And if you're a Johnny, you know what I'm talking about. And an Ole the same way. I mean, we are uniquely blessed. So thank you.
But let's have a serious word as to help wrap that up. Then this is actually not a bad segue. So thank you for that. We are talking about making some systemic changes here. As I said at the outset, we hope this is more than an exercise in nostalgia or a good history lesson, that we're hoping to be a nudge for some changes here, and we believe that some smart moves in our system could make a big difference. But a lot of what Americans still need is good citizenship. And I know that there's a lot of good citizenship in Minnesota, and especially in greater Minnesota. The critical thinking that is taught in liberal arts colleges and in colleges like this state university is crucial. We are bombarded with a lot of information right now that citizens have to sort out for themselves and have to decide which sources of information to trust. We have citizens who need to come together in new ways and with reliable people, and to make good judgments about what it is, how we use government judiciously, wisely, well, honestly, but use that tool rather than dismissing out of hand that tool as inappropriate for the complex society that we have right now. I often say people seem hungry, in my mind, not for necessarily less government, but government on their sides. And we have to figure out what that means and how to make that happen. So we do need the kind of engagement that all of you are showing by coming out today on a rainy May 1st. So we're grateful for your interest and your support, and we'll be glad to talk to you further and sign a few books. So thank you for having us today.
Yeah, thank you all very much. Right.
Thank you so much for coming. Again, there's books for sale if you'd like to buy a book, and thank you for coming out today.
Thank you, Anita.